one of the things we've all met is the accusation that we are strident or arrogant or vitriolic or shrill. What do we think about that?
Yeah, well, I'm amused by it because I went out of my way in my book to address reasonable religious people, and I flew the draft with groups of students who were deeply religious. And indeed, the first draft incurred some real anguish. And so I made adjustments. And it didn't do any good in the end because I still got hammered for being rude and aggressive. And I came to realize that it's a no-win situation. It's a mug's game. The religions have contrived to make it impossible to disagree with them critically without being rude.
Without being rude.
They sort of play the hurt feelings card at every opportunity, and you're faced with the choice of, well, am I going to be rude, or am I going to articulate this criticism? Yeah. I mean, am I going to articulate it, or am I just going to button my lip?
Right. Well, that's what it is to trespass a taboo. I think we're all encountering the fact that religion is held off the table of rational criticism in some kind of formal way, even by, we're discovering, our fellow secularists and our fellow atheists. Just leave people to their own superstition, even if it's abject and causing harm, and don't look too closely at it.
Now that was, of course, the point of the title of my book, is there is this spell and we got to break it.
But if the charge of offensiveness in general is to be allowed in public discourse, then without self-pity, I think we should say that we too can be offended and insulted. I mean, I'm not just in disagreement when someone like Tariq Ramadan, accepted now at the high tables of Oxford University as a spokesman, says the most he'll demand when it comes to the stoning of women is a moratorium on it. I find that profoundly much more than annoying.
Right, yeah.
Insulting, not only insulting, but actually threatening.
But you're not offended. This is, you don't take any, I don't see you taking things personally. You're alarmed by the liabilities of certain ways of thinking, as in Ramadan's case.
But he would say, or people like him would say, that if I doubt the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad, I've injured them in their deepest feelings.
Right.
Well, I am in fact, I think all people ought to be offended, at least in their deepest integrity, by, say, the religious proposition that without a supernatural celestial dictatorship, we wouldn't know right from wrong. That we only live by.
But are you really offended by that? Doesn't it just seem wrong?
No, I say only, Sam, that if the offensiveness charge is to be allowed in general and arbitrated by the media, then I think we're entitled to claim that much without being self-pitying or representing ourselves as an oppressed minority, which I think is an opposite danger, I would admit. I'd like to add also that that I agree with Daniel that there's no way in which the charge against us can be completely avoided, because what we say does offend the very core of any serious religious person at any rate. If we deny the divinity of Jesus, for example, many people will be terrifically shocked and possibly hurt. It's just too bad.
I'm fascinated by the contrast between the amount of offense that's taken by religion and the amount of offense that people take against really anything else, like your artistic taste, your taste in music, your taste in art, your politics. You can be not exactly as rude as you like, but you can be far, far more rude about such things. And I'd quite like to try to quantify that, to actually do research about it, actually test people with statements about their favorite football team or their favorite piece of music or something, and see how far you can go before they take offense, compared to, is there anything else, apart from, say, how ugly your face is, that gives such...
Or your husband's or wife's or girlfriend's or partner's face.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I regularly debate with the terrible man called John Donoghue of the Catholic Defence League, and he actually is righteously upset by certain trends in modern art, which tend to draw attention to themselves by blasphemy. Well, for example, Serrano's Piss Christ, or the elephant dung on the Virgin, and so. And indeed, I think it's quite important that we share with Sophocles and other pre-monotheists a revulsion to desecration or to profanity. That we don't want to see churches desecrated or
no, indeed not.
religious icons trashed and so forth. We we share an admiration for at least some of the aesthetic achievements of religion.
Right. I think this whole notion of I think our criticism is actually more barbed than that, in the sense that we are offending people, but we're also telling them that they're wrong to be offended. I mean, physicists aren't offended when their view of physics is disproved or challenged. I mean, this is just not the way rational minds operate when they're really trying to get at what's true in the world. And religions purport to be representing reality, and yet there's this peevish and tribal and ultimately dangerous reflexive response to having these ideas challenged. I think we're pointing to the total liability of that.
Well, and two, there's no polite way to say to somebody,
you've wasted your life.
Do you realize you've wasted your life? Do you realize that you've just devoted all your efforts and all your goods to a glorification of something which is just a myth? Or have you ever considered even if you say, have you even considered the possibility that maybe you've wasted your life on this? There's no inoffensive way of saying that, but we do have to say it because they should jolly well consider it. Same as we do about our own lives.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dan Barker's making a collection of clergymen who've lost their faith, but don't dare say so because it's their only living. It's the only thing they know what to do.
I've heard from one of them at least.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yes.
I used to have this when I was younger in arguments with the members of the Communist Party. They sort of knew that it was all up with the Soviet Union. Many of them had suffered a lot and sacrificed a great deal and struggled manfully to keep what they thought was the great ideal alive. Their mainspring had broken, but they couldn't give it up because it would involve a similar concession.
Right.
But that certainly, if anyone said to me, how could you say that to them about the Soviet Union? Didn't you know you were going to really make them cry and hurt their feelings? I said, don't be ridiculous. Don't be absurd. But it's I find it, in many cases, almost an exactly analogous argument.
When people tell me I'm being rude and vicious and terribly aggressive in a way that I should, I say, if I were saying these things about the pharmaceutical industry or the oil interests, would it be rude? Would it be off limits? No.
Of course it wouldn't.
Right. Well, I want religion to be treated just the way we treat the pharmaceuticals and the oil industry. I'm not against pharmaceutical companies. I'm against some of the things they do, but I just want to put religions on the same page with them.
Including denying them tax exemption.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, or in the English case, state subsidy.
I'm curious how religion acquired this charmed status that it has compared to any of these other things. I mean, somehow we've all bought into it, whether we're religious or not, and that some historical process has led to this immunization of religion against, well, this hyper offense taking that religion is allowed to take.
And what's particularly amusing to me, finally, at first it infuriated me, but now I'm amused, is they've managed to enlist legions of non-religious people who take offense on their behalf.
And how?
In fact,
Yes.
the most vicious reviews of my book have been by people who are not themselves religious, but they're terribly afraid of hurting the feelings of the people that are religious, and they chastise me worse than anybody
Exactly
who's
my
actually
experience.
religious.
Exactly my experience.
And I think so. One of you pointed out how condescending that view is. That
Yes.
It's as though it's like the idea of penitentiaries. I mean, they're, other people need them. You know, that
That's
we
right.
must keep
Yes.
these people
Yes.
safely in their midst.
Yes.
Well, I think there's one answer to that question, which may illuminate a difference that or at least a difference that I have with I think maybe all three of you. There's something about. I mean, I still use words like spiritual and mystical without furrowing my brow too much, and I mean, to the consternation of many atheists. I think there is a range of experience that is rare and that is only talked about without obvious qualms in religious discourse, and because it's only talked about in religious discourse, it is just riddled with superstition, and it's used to cash out various metaphysical schemes which it can't reasonably do. But clearly people have extraordinary experiences, whether they have them on LSD, or they have them because they were alone in a cave for a year, or they have them because they just happen to have the neurology that is particularly labile that allows for it. but people have self-transcending experiences, and people have the best day of their life where everything seemed, they seemed at one with nature.
Sure.
And for that, because religion seems to be the only game in town in talking about those experiences and dignifying them, that's one reason why I think it seems to be taboo to criticize it, because you're talking about the most important moments in people's lives and trashing them, at least from their view.
Well, I don't have to agree with you, Sam, in order to say that it's a very good thing you're saying that sort of thing, because it shows that, as you say, religion is not the only game in town when it comes to being spiritual. It's like it's a good idea to have somebody from the political right who is an atheist, because otherwise there's a confusion of values which doesn't help us, and it's much better to have this diversity in other areas. I mean, I think I sort of do agree with you, but even if I didn't, I think it was valuable to have that.
Right.
If one could make one change, and only one, mine would be to distinguish the numinous from the supernatural.
Yes.
Right.
You had a marvelous quotation from Francis Collins, the genome pioneer, who said, while mountaineering one day, he was just overcome by the landscape, and then went down on his knees and accepted Jesus Christ. A complete non sequitur. It's never even been suggested that Jesus Christ created that landscape.
Right. A frozen waterfall in three streams.
Three parts.
Which put him in the mind of the Trinity.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We're all triune in one way or another. We're programmed for that. That's very clear. It wouldn't ever have been a four-headed God.
Right.
You know that from experience. But that would be an enormous distinction to make, and I think it would clear up a lot of people's confusion that what we have in our emotions, the surplus value of our personalities, the bits that aren't particularly useful for our evolution, or that we can't prove are, but that do belong to us all the same, don't belong to the supernatural and are not to be conscripted or annexed by any priesthood.
Yes, it's a sad fact that people, in a sense, won't trust their own valuing of their numinous experiences. They think it isn't really as good as it seems unless it's from God, unless it's in some kind of a proof of religion. No, it's just as wonderful as it seems. It's just as important. It is the best moment in your life. And it's the moment when you forget yourself and become better than you ever thought you could be in some way, and see in all humbleness the wonderfulness of nature. That's it, and that's wonderful. But it doesn't add anything to say, golly, that has to have been given to me by somebody even more wonderful.
It's been hijacked, hasn't it? By
It's also, I'm afraid, I think it's a deformity or a shortcoming in the human personality, frankly, because the religion keeps stressing how humble it is and how meek it is and how accepting and almost to the point of self-abnegation it is. But actually it makes extraordinarily arrogant claims for these moments. It says that I suddenly realized that the universe was all about me.
Yes.
And felt terrifically humble about it. Come on, we can laugh people out of that, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Also,
And I think we
must.
should. I am so tired of the, if only Professor Dennett had the humility to blah, 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 and
Yes.
humility. And this from people of breathtaking arrogance.
Yeah.
I think,
Who shove one aside saying, just don't mind me, I'm on an errand for God.
Yeah, right.
This is a
How
point.
modest is that?
This is the point I think we should return to, this notion of the arrogance of science.
Oh,
because
yeah.
there is no discourse which enforces humility more rigorously. I mean, scientists, in my experience, are the first people to say they don't know. I mean, if you get a scientist to start talking off his area of specialization, he or she immediately starts hedging his bet, saying, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, and of course, all the data's not in. I mean, this is the mode of discourse in which we are most candid about the scope of our ignorance.
Well, actually, a lot of academics come up with that kind of false modesty. But I do know what you mean.
Yes, it is.
Many's the historian who says, no, I yield. It's just someone.
No, but any academic should do that.
Yes, they should.
The thing about religious people is that they recite the Nicene Creed every week, which says precisely what they believe. There are three gods, not one. The Virgin Mary, Jesus died, went to down for 3 days and then came up again.
Yeah.
In precise detail. And yet they have the gall to accuse us of being overconfident and of not knowing what it is to doubt.
And I don't think many of them ever let themselves contemplate the question which I think scientists ask themselves all the time: what if I'm wrong?
Yeah.
What if I'm wrong? I mean, it's just not part of their repertoire.
Actually, would you mind if I disagree with you about that? I mean, a lot of the talk that makes religious people hard to, not hard to beat, but hard to argue with, is precisely that they'll say they're in a permanent crisis of faith. There is indeed a prayer, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. Graham Greene says the great thing about being a Catholic was that it was a challenge to his unbelief. A lot of people live by keeping two sets of books. In fact, it's my impression.
There is that.
It's my impression, in fact, that a majority of the people I know who call themselves believers or people of faith do that all the time. I wouldn't say it was schizophrenia. That would be rude. But they're quite aware of the implausibility of what they say. They don't act on it when they go to the doctor or when they travel or anything of this kind. But in some sense, they couldn't be without you. But they're quite respectful of the idea of doubt. In fact, they try and build it in when they can.
Well, that's interesting then. And so when they are reciting the creed with its total sort of apparent conviction, is this a kind of mantra which is forcing themselves to overcome doubt by saying, yes, I do believe, I do believe, I do believe, because really I don't.
And of course, like the others, like their secular counterparts, they're glad other people believe it. It's an affirmation they wouldn't want other people not to be making.
Well, also there's this curious bootstrapping move, which I tried to point out in this recent On Faith piece. This idea that you start with the premise that belief without evidence is especially noble. I mean, this is the doctrine of faith. This is the parable of doubting Thomas. And so you start with that, and then you add this notion, which has come to me through various debates, that the fact that people can believe without evidence is itself a subtle form of evidence. I mean, we're kind of wired to, actually Francis Collins, you mentioned, brings this up in his book. The fact that we have this intuition of God is itself some subtle form of evidence. And this is kind of kindling phenomenon where once you say it's good to start without evidence, the fact that you can is a subtle form of evidence, and then the demand for any more evidence is itself a kind of corruption of the intellect or a temptation or something to be guarded against, and you get a kind of perpetual motion machine of self-deception where you can get this thing up and running.
But they like the idea that it can't be demonstrated, because then there'd be nothing to be faithful about.
Right. That's the point of faith. Yeah.
If everyone had seen the resurrection, and we all knew that we'd been saved by it, so then we would be living in an unalterable system of belief, and it would have to be policed.
Right. Well,
and it would actually be, those of us who don't believe in it are very glad it's not true, because we think it would be horrible. Those who do believe it don't want it to be absolutely proven, so there can't be any doubt about it, because then there's no wrestling with the conscience, there are no dark nights of the soul.
It was a review of one of our books, I don't remember which, but it was exactly that point, that just, what a crass expectation on the part of atheists that there should be total evidence for this. I mean, there'd be much less magic. You know, if everyone was compelled to believe by too much evidence. Actually, this is Francis Collins. I'm sorry. This is Francis Collins.
A friend of mine, Canon Fenton of Oxford, actually, said that if the church validated the Holy Shroud of Turin, he personally would leave the ranks, because if they were doing things like that, he didn't want any part of it.
Right.
I didn't expect when I started off my book tour to be as lucky as I was. I mean, Jerry Falwell died in my first week on the road. That was amazing.
Yes, that was amazing luck.
I didn't expect Mother Teresa to come out as an atheist. But reading her letters, which I now have, it's rather interesting. She writes, I can't bring myself to believe any of this. She tells all her confessors, all her superiors, I can't hear a voice, I can't feel a presence, even in the Mass, even in the sacrament. It's no small thing. And they write back to us saying, that's good. Right. That's great. You're suffering. It gives you a share in the crucifixion. It makes you part of Calvary. Yeah. You can't beat an argument like that.
Right.
The less you believe it, the more you're an illustration
the more
of faith.
You prove it's true. Yeah.
Yes, and the struggle, the dark night of the soul is the proof in itself. Yeah. So we just have to realize that these really are non-overlapping magisteria. We can't hope to argue with a mentality of this kind.
But we can do just what you're doing now, and that is, we can say, look at this interesting bag of tricks that have evolved. Notice that they're circular, that they're self-sustaining, that they don't have any, that they could be about anything. And then you don't argue with them. You simply point out that these are not valid ways of thinking about anything, because you could use the very same tricks to sustain something which was manifestly fraudulent. And in fact, what fascinates me is that a lot of the tricks they have their counterparts with con artists. They use the very same forms of non-argument, the very same non sequiturs, and they make, for instance, they make a virtue out of trust. And as soon as you start exhibiting any suspicion of the con man he gets all hurt on you and plays the hurt feelings card and reminds you how wonderful taking it on faith is, and how I mean, there aren't any new tricks. These tricks have evolved over.
And
over
one could add
years.
the production of bogus special effects as well, which is
Yeah.
one of the things that completely convicts religion of being fraudulent. The belief in the miraculous. The same people will say, well, Einstein felt a spiritual force in the universe, when he said the whole point about it is there are no miracles. There are no changes in the natural order. That's the miraculous thing. They're completely cynical about claiming him.
Well, the other thing worth pointing out,
almost the same breath,
is that every religious person feels the same criticism of other people's faith that we do as atheists. I mean, they reject the pseudo miracles and the pseudo claims to certainty of others, and they see the confidence tricks in other people's faith, and they see it rather readily. You know, every Christian knows the Quran can't be the perfect word of the Creator of the universe, and anyone who thinks it is hasn't read it closely enough, and it's just in this hermetically sealed discourse that isn't really being self-critical. And I think we're on very strong. We make a very strong case when we point that out, and point out also that whatever people are experiencing in church or in prayer, no matter how positive, the fact that Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and Christians are all experiencing it proves that it can't be a matter of the divinity of Jesus or the unique sanctity of the Quran, or because
there's 17 different ways of getting there. Yeah.
By the way, on that, a tiny point. It's not. I hope not a digression. It's useful bearing that in mind too when you get, as I did this morning on ABC News, the question, well, wouldn't you say religion did some good in the world? I mean, there are good people. You never don't get that argument. And by the way, there's no reason why one shouldn't. You say, well, yes, I have indeed heard it said that Hamas provides social services in Gaza. And I've even heard it said that Louis Farrakhan's group gets young black men in prison off drugs. I don't know if it's true. I'm willing to accept it might be. It doesn't alter the fact that the one is a militarized terrorist organization with a fanatical anti-Semitic ideology, and the second is a racist crackpot cult.
Yeah. And the other
I have no doubt that Scientology gets people off drugs too. But my insistence always with these people is, if you will claim it for one, you must accept it for them all.
And the other move you can make there,
because if you don't, it's flat out dishonest.
You can invent an ideology which, by your mere invention in that moment, is obviously untrue, which would be quite useful if propagated to billions. I mean,
That's right.
You could say, this is my new religion. Teach people to demand that your children study science and math and economics and all of our terrestrial disciplines to the best of their abilities. And if they don't persist in those efforts, they'll be tortured after death by 17 demons. This would be extremely useful, and it would be far more useful than Islam, propagated to billions. And yet, what are the chances that the 17 demons exist? Zero.
There's a slipperiness too, isn't there, about one way of speaking to sophisticated intellectuals and theologians, and another way of speaking to congregations, and above all, children. And I think we've all of us been accused of going after the easy targets of the Jerry Falwells of this world and ignoring the sophisticated professors of theology. And I mean, I don't know what you feel about that, but one of the things I feel is that the sophisticated professors of theology will say one thing to each other and to intellectuals generally, but will say something totally different to a congregation. They'll talk about miracles, they'll talk about...
Well, they won't talk to a congregation.
Well, archbishops will.
Yes, but when the sophisticated theologians try to talk to the preachers won't have any of it.
Well, that's true.
I mean, you got to realize that sophisticated theology is like stamp collecting. It's a very specialized thing, and only a few people do it.
And a negligible influence.
They take in their own laundry, and And they get all excited about some very arcane details, and their own religions pay almost no attention to what they're saying. A little bit of it does, of course, filter in, but it always gets beefed up again for general consumption, because what they say in their writings, at least from my experience, is eye-glazing, mind-twisting, very subtle things which have no particular bearing on life.
Oh, no, I must insist. I must say a good word here for Professor Alistair McGrath, who in his attack on Richard said it's not true, as we've always been told, and most Christians believe, that Tertullian said, credo quae absurdum, I believe it because it's ridiculous. No, it turns out, I've checked this now, though I don't know this from McGrath, that in fact Tertullian said, the impossibility of it is the thing that makes it the most believable. That's a well distinction, I think. And very useful for training one's mind.
As opposed to absurdity?
Very useful for training one's mind in the fine points. It's the likelihood, in other words, that it could have been made up,
Right.
is diminished by the incredibility of it. Who would try and invent something that was that
it's so
unbelievable?
awful.
You make some very good points
that
on
actually
those
is that actually is
That's a good
I
point.
think a debate perfectly well worth having. What I say to these people is this: you're sending your email or your letter to the wrong address. Everyone says, let's not judge religion by its fundamentalists. All right. Take the Church of England. Two of whose senior leaders recently said that the floods in North Yorkshire were the result of homosexual behaviour. Not in North Yorkshire, presumably, but probably in London, I think they were thinking. But
God's aim is a little
one
off.
one of these, the Bishop of Carlisle, is apparently about to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, this is extraordinary. This is supposed to be the mild and reflective and thoughtful and rather, troubled church, making fanatical pronouncements. Well, I want to hear what Alistair McGrath is going to write to the Bishop of Carlisle, not to me. Is he going to say, my Lord Bishop, do you not realize what a complete idiot you're making of yourself and of our church? Did he do this? If he did it in private, I'm not impressed. He has to say it in public.
The Bishop
Why are
of
they
Carlisle
telling me
backtracked.
I will judge the church by the
Yes.
statements of its bishops. And I think I'm allowed to.
Yeah. But the other thing is that, never mind about the academic theologians, bishops and vicars, who will attack us for taking scriptures, or for accusing people of taking scriptures literally. And of course we don't believe the book of Genesis literally. And yet they do preach about what Adam and Eve did, as though they did exist, as though it's a sort of license to talk about things which they know and anybody of any sophistication knows is fiction. And yet they will treat their congregations, their sheep, as though they did exist, as though they were factual. And a huge number of those congregations actually think they did exist.
Can you imagine any one of these preachers saying, as such a topic is introduced, this is a sort of theoretical fiction. It's not true, but it's a very fine metaphor. No, they're just
They
not
kind of,
going.
after the fact, imply that that's what they expect you to know.
Yes, but they would never announce it. They would
Well,
never
there's
say
another
it.
point there, is that they never admit how they have come to stop taking it literally. Because you have all these people criticizing us for our crass literalism, we're as fundamentalist as the fundamentalists. And yet these moderates don't admit how they have come to be moderate. What does moderation consist of? It consists of having lost faith in all of these propositions, or half of them, because of just the hammer blows of science and secular politics.
Of the
and
crass
rationality.
literalism of the critics.
Yeah,
Yes.
religion has lost its mandate on 1,000 questions, and moderates tend to argue that this is somehow a triumph of faith, that faith is somehow self-enlightening, whereas it's been enlightened from the outside. It has been, it has been intruded upon by
On
science.
that point that I was wanting to raise myself about our own so-called fundamentalism. There's a cleric in Southwark, the first person I saw attacking you and I in print as being just as fundamentalist as those who blew up the London Underground. Do you remember his name?
I don't remember his name.
I'm sorry, I don't remember. He's a very senior Anglican cleric in the Diocese of Southwark. I went on the BBC with him, just entre parenthèses, I'll say, when I'd said, how can you call your congregation a flock? Doesn't that say everything about your religion, that you think they're sheep? He said, well, actually, I used to be a pastor in New Guinea, where there aren't any sheep. Well, of course, there are a lot of places where there are no sheep. Gospel's quite hard to teach as a result. We found out what the most important animal to the locals was, and I remember very well my local bishop rising to ask the Divine One to behold these swine, his new congregation. But this is the man who deliberately does a thing like that, that's as cynical as you could wish, and as adaptive as the day is long. And he says that we who doubt it are as fundamentalists as people who blow up their fellow citizens on the London Underground. It's unconscionable. Thus, I don't really mind being accused of ridiculing or treating with contempt people like that. I just frankly have no choice. I have the faculty of humor, and some of it has an edge to it. I'm not going to repress that for the sake of politeness of people.
Would you think that it would be good to make a distinction between the professionals and the amateurs? I share your impatience with the officials of the churches, the people whose this is their professional life. It seems to me they know better.
Right.
The congregations don't know better because it's maintained that they should not know better. I do get very anxious about ridiculing the beliefs of the flock because of the way in which they have ceded to their leaders. They've delegated authority to their leaders, and they presume their leaders are going to do it right. So I think in this, who stands up and says the buck stops here? Right. Well, it seems to me it's the preachers themselves, it's the priests, it's the bishops, and we really should hold their feet to the fire. For instance, just take the issue of creationism. If somebody in a fundamentalist church thinks that creationism makes sense because their pastor told them, well, I can understand that and excuse that. We all get a lot of what we take to be true from people that we respect and whom we view as authorities. We don't check everything out. But where did the pastor get this idea? And I don't care where he or she is responsible because their job is to know what they're talking about in a way that the congregation isn't.
We have to be a little bit careful not to sound condescending when we say that, and in a way it's reflecting the condescension of the preacher.
Yes, because I'll take things that you and Richard say on the human and natural sciences, not without wanting to check, but I'm often unable to, but knowing that you are the sort of gentleman who would have checked. If you say, the bishop told me it, so I believe it, you make a fool of yourself, it seems to me, and one is entitled to say so. Just as one is entitled when dealing with an ordinary racist to say that his opinions are revolting. Right. He may know no better, but that's not going to save him from my condemnation. And nor should it. And I think exactly it's condescending not to confront people, as it were, one by one, or en masse. So public opinion is often wrong. Mob opinion is almost always wrong.
Let's linger
Religious
on this
opinion
issue
is
of
wrong.
authority.
Religious opinion is wrong by definition. We can't avoid this. I wanted to intrude the name H.L. Mencken at this point. Mm-hmm. Now, a very and justly celebrated American writer, not particularly to my taste, much too much of a Nietzschean, and what really was once meant by social Darwinists at one stage. But why did he win the tremendous respect of so many people in this country in the 20s and 30s? Because he said, the people who believe what the Methodists tell them and what William Jennings Bryan tells them are fools. They're not being fooled, they are fools. They should...
Shame on them for believing these.
Yes, they make themselves undignified and ignorant, and no mincing of words here, and a great admixture of wit and evidence and reasoning. It absolutely works. It's the most successful anti-religious polemic there's probably ever been in the modern world. In the 20th century, anyway.
I think we just touched upon an issue that we should really highlight this whole
Yeah.
notion of authority, because
Yeah.
religious people often argue that science is just a tissue of uncashed checks. You know, we're all
Yeah, yeah.
relying on authority. How do you know that the cosmological constant is whatever it is? You know, so I think you two are well placed to do this. Differentiate the kind of faith placing in authority that we practice without fear in science and rationality generally, and the kind of faith placing in the preacher or the theologian that we criticize.
Well, what we actually do when we who are not physicists take on trust what physicists say is we have some evidence to suggest that physicists have looked into the matter, that they've done experiments, that they've peer-reviewed their papers, that they've criticized each other, that they've been subjected to massive criticism from their peers in seminars and in lectures and things. And they've come through.
And remember the structure that's there too. It's not just that there's peer review, but it's very important that it's competitive. For instance, when Fermat's last theorem was proved by
Andrew Wiles.
Andrew Wiles. The reason that those of us who, forget it, I'm never going to understand that proof, but the reason that we can be confident that it really is a proof is that
Nobody wanted him to get there
every
first.
other mathematician who was competent in the world was very well motivated to study
find
that,
it,
and believe me, if they begrudge him that this is a proof, it's a proof.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like that nothing like that.
No, because
in
when
The
religion.
antithesis of
No,
that.
no religious person has ever been able to say what Einstein said. If I'm right, the following solar event will occur off the west coast of Africa in, I forget how many years and months from now, and it did, within a very tiny degree of variation. There's never been a prophecy that's been vindicated like that, or anyone willing
Yep.
to place their reputation and their, as it were, their life on the idea that it would be.
I was once asked at a public meeting, don't you think that the mysteriousness of quantum theory is just the same as the mysteriousness of the Trinity or the transubstantiation? And the answer, of course, can be answered in two quotes from Richard Feynman. One, Richard Feynman said, if you think you understand quantum theory, you don't understand quantum theory. He was admitting that it's highly mysterious. But the other thing is that the predictions of quantum theory experimentally are verified to the equivalent of predicting the width of North America to the width of one human hair. Right. And so quantum theory is massively supported by accurate predictions, even if you don't understand the mystery of the Copenhagen interpretation or whatever it is. Right. Whereas the mystery of the Trinity doesn't even try to make a prediction, let alone an accurate one.
You know, I don't like.
It isn't a mystery either.
I don't like the use of the word mystery here.
Yes.
I think there's been a lot of consciousness raising in philosophy about this term, where we have so-called Mysterians, the new Mysterians. These are people who like the term mystery. Noam Chomsky is famously quoted to say, "There's two kinds of questions: there's puzzles and mysteries. Puzzles are soluble, mysteries aren't." And first of all, I just don't buy that, but I buy the distinction and say there's nothing about mystery in science. There's puzzles, there's deep puzzles, there's things we don't know, there's things we'll never know, but they aren't systematically incomprehensible to human beings. The glorification of the idea that these things are systematically incomprehensible is, I think, has no place in science.
Which is why I think we should be quite happy to revive traditional terms in our discourse, such as obscurantism and obfuscation, is what they really are. And to point out that these things can make intelligent people act stupidly. John Cornwell, who's just written another attack on yourself, Richard, and who is an old friend of mine, a very brilliant guy, wrote one of the best studies of the Catholic Church and fascism that has been published. He's in his review of you, he says, Professor Dawkins should just look at the shelves of books there are on the Trinity. The library is full of attempts to solve this problem before he's certain. But none of the books in those religious libraries solve it either.
Yeah.
The whole point is that it remains insoluble. and is used to keep people feeling baffled and inferior.
But I want to come back to the thing about mystery in physics, because isn't it possible that our evolved brains, because we evolved in what I call middle world, where we never have to cope with either the very small or the cosmologically very large, we may never actually have an intuitive feel for what's going on in quantum mechanics, but we can still test its predictions. We can still actually do the mathematics and do the physics to actually test the predictions, because anybody can read the dials on a...
Right. I think what we can see is that what scientists have constructed over the centuries is a series of tools, mind tools, thinking tools, mathematical tools, and so forth, which enable us to some degree to overcome the limitations of our evolved brains, our Stone Age, if you like, brains. And overcoming those limitations is not always direct. Sometimes you have to give up something. Yes, you'll just never be able to, as you say, to be able to think intuitively about this. But you can know that even though you can't think intuitively about it, there's this laborious process by which you can make progress, and you do have to cede a certain authority to the process, but you can test that, and it can carry you from A to B. In the same way, if you're if you're a quadriplegic, an artificial device can carry you from A to B. Doesn't mean you can walk from A to B, but you can get from A to B.
Yes, I mean the bolder physicists will say, "Well, who cares about intuition? I mean, just look at the math."
That's right. They are comfortable with with living with their prostheses.
Well, the perfect example of that is just dimensions beyond 3, because we can't visualize a fourth dimension or a fifth, but it's trivial to represent it mathematically. And so we can move into other domains.
And now we teach our undergraduates how to manipulate n-dimensional spaces and to think about vectors in n-dimensional spaces. And they get used to the fact they can't quite what you do is you imagine 3 of them and say, you wave your hand a little bit and say, more of the same. But you check your intuition by running the maths, and it works.
But it's easy to do something. Say you're a psychologist looking at personality, and you say there are 15 dimensions of personality, and you could think of them as being 15 dimensions in space. And anybody can see that you can imagine moving along any one of those dimensions with respect to the others, and you don't actually have to visualize 15-dimensional space.
No, and you give up that demand, and you realize, I can live without that. It would be nice if I could do that, but hey, I can't see bacteria with the naked eye either. I can live without that. But
I think there's one.
I was challenged on that. I was challenged on the radio the other day by someone.
Can't
who
see bacteria.
appeared to be fairly qualified. No, said that I believed in atoms on no evidence because I'd never seen one. Not since George Galloway said to me that he'd never seen a barrel of oil.
Right. That's cute. That
but you realize that people at this point, they're wearing themselves right down to their uppers. I mean, they're desperate when they get to this stage. The reason I say it is because I think it could, I don't want us to make our lives easier, but it makes the argument a little more simple. We are quite willing to say there are many things we don't know. Haldane, I think it was, said, the universe is not just queerer than we understand, it's queerer than we can understand. We know there'll be great new discoveries. We know we'll live to see great things, but we know there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. That's the whole distinction. The believer has to say not just that there is a God, the deist position, that there may be a mind at work in the universe, a proposition we can't disprove, but they know that mind and can interpret it. They're on good terms with it. They get occasional revelations from it.
They have a book that is verbatim
briefings from it. Now, any decent argument, any decent intellect has to begin by excluding people who claim to know more than they can possibly know. You start off by saying, well, that's wrong to begin with. Now can we get on with it? So theism's gone in the first round. It's off the island.
Exactly.
It's out of the show.
That's a footnote I wanted to add to what Dan was saying. Even if mystery was somehow something we had to just, a bitter pill we have to swallow in the end. We are cognitively closed to the truth at some level. That still doesn't give any scope to theism.
Absolutely not, because it's just as close to them as it is to those who aren't.
And also they claim perfect transparency of revelation.
And also they can't be allowed to forget what they used to say when they were strong enough to get away with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is, this is really true,
right,
in every detail. And if you don't believe it,
we'll kill you. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll kill you, and it may take some days to kill you, but we will get the job done. Yeah.
Yes.
No, they wouldn't have the power they have now if they hadn't had the power they had then.
Right.
And you know, this, what you just said, Christopher, actually, I think strikes terror, strikes anxiety in a lot of religious hearts, because it just hasn't been brought home to them that this move of theirs is just off limits. It's just not, it's not the game. It's not, it doesn't, you can't do that. And they've been taught all their lives that you can do that. This is a legitimate way of conducting a discussion. And here suddenly we're just telling them, I'm sorry, that is not a move in this game. In fact, it is a disqualifying move.
Right.
And
precisely the move you can't be respected for making.
Yeah, yes. Just
adumbrate the move for me a bit, if you would, or for us. Perhaps only for me. Say what you think that move is.
Somebody plays the faith card.
Yes.
They say, look, I am a Christian, and we Christians, we just have to believe this, and that's it. At which point, I guess the polite way of saying it is, well, okay, if that's true, you'll just have to excuse yourself from the discussion because you've declared yourself incompetent to proceed with an open mind. Now, if you really can't defend your view, then sorry, you can't put it forward. We're not going to let you play the faith card. Now, if you want to defend what your holy book says in terms that we can appreciate, fine. But because it says it in the holy book, that just doesn't cut any ice at all. And if you think it does, you're clearly, that is, first of all, that's just arrogant. It is a bullying move, and we're just not going to accept it.
And it's a move that they don't accept when done in the name of another faith.
Exactly.
But now, in which case, could I ask you something, all three of you who are wiser than I on this matter, what do we think of Victor Stenger's book that says that we can now scientifically disprove the existence of God? Do you have a view of this?
Which God? I haven't read the book. Which God?
The God of
any kind of...
Either creating one, or supervising one, and certainly an intervening one. I mean, I think that's fairly exhaustive. My view had always been that since we have to live with uncertainty, only those who are certain leave the room before the discussion can become adult. Victor Stenger seems to think now we've got to the stage where we can say with reasonable confidence it's disproved, not as not vindicated or better explanation proposed. But I just thought it'd be an interesting proposition because it matters a lot to me that our opinions are congruent with uncertainty.
Right. Well, I think the weak link...
And in other words, with doubt.
Yeah, I was a big fan of his book and actually blurbed it, but I think the weakest link is this foundational claim on the texts, this idea that we know that the Bible is the perfect word of an omniscient deity, because that is an especially weak claim, and it really is the claim. It is really the gold in their epistemological gold standard. I mean, it all rests on that. That if the Bible is not a magic book, Christianity in this case evaporates. If the Quran is not a magic book, Islam evaporates. And when you look at the books and ask yourself, is there the slightest shred of evidence that this is the product of omniscience? Is there a single sentence in here that could not have been uttered by a person for whom a wheelbarrow would have been, emergent technology? You have to say no. I mean, there's not. If the Bible had an account of DNA and electricity and other things that would astonish us, then okay, our jaws drop suitably, and we have to have a sensible conversation about the source of this knowledge.
Dinesh D'Souza makes this claim in his new book. He's going to be, by the way, one of the much more literate and well-read and educated of our antagonists. I'm going to be debating soon. He says that in Genesis, which people used to mock, they said, "Let there be light," and then only a few staves later you get the sun and the moon and the stars.
Right.
How could that be? Well, that's actually, according to the Big Bang, that would be right.
Yeah, but that's
The Bang
pathetic.
precedes the galaxies.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, believe me, it's pathetic
Right.
too. But
Right. Well, I try to demonstrate this cast of mind in, I think, a very long endnote in the End of Faith, where I say any text can be read. Well, with the eyes of faith, you can make magical impressions out of any text. So I literally walked into a bookstore, the cookbook aisle of a bookstore, randomly opened a cookbook, found a recipe for wok, I think it was wok seared shrimp with Ogo relish or something, and then came up with a mystical interpretation of the recipe. And you can do it. I mean, you can connect the dots with any crazy text
Well,
and find wisdom in it.
Michael Shermer did it with the Bible code.
Right, I haven't seen that.
The
but
hidden
yeah.
messages in the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very
Yeah.
good. You can write yesterday's headlines
Yeah.
from it
Right.
anytime you like. Yeah.
I have a question for the three of you. Is there any argument for faith, any challenge to your atheism that has given you pause, that has sent you back on your heels, where you felt you didn't have a ready answer, etc.?
I actually can't think of any.
I mean, I think the closest is the idea that the fundamental constants of the universe are too good to be true, and that does seem to me to need some kind of explanation if it's true. I mean, Victor Stenger doesn't think it is true, but many physicists do. I don't think, I mean, it certainly doesn't in any way suggest to me a creative intelligence, because you're still left with the problem of explaining where that came from.
Right.
And a creative intelligence who's sufficiently creative and intelligent enough to fine-tune the constants of the universe to give rise to us has got to be a lot more fine-tuned himself than...
Yeah. Why create all the other planets in our solar system dead?
Well, that's a separate question.
Yeah. Say, well, if it was that good.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
Bishop Montefiore was very good at this. Was a former friend of mine. Say that you have to marvel at the conditions of life and the knife edge on which they are. So it is a knife edge. Yes, our planet is a lot of it too hot or too cold.
Right.
It's on a climate. The other planets are completely too hot or too cold to support life. That's just one solar system, the only one we know about where there is life. Not much of a designer, and of course you can't get out of the infinite regress. But I've not come across a single persuasive argument of that kind. But I wouldn't have expected to, because as I realized when I thought one evening, they never come up with anything new. Well, why would they? Their arguments are very old by definition. And they were all evolved when we knew very, very little about the natural order. The only argument that I find at all attractive, and this is for faith, you asked, as well as for theism, is what I suppose I'd call the apotropaic, when people say all the praise belongs to God for this, he's to be thanked for all this. That is actually a form of modesty. It's a superstitious one. That's why I say apotropaic. But
Right.
it's avoiding hubris. It's also for that reason, obviously pre-monotheistic. But religion does or can help people to avoid hubris, I think, morally and intellectually, and that might be a.
But that's not an
small-
argument that it's true.
Oh, for heaven's sake! No, there are and cannot be any such arguments. I think.
Well, maybe I should broaden this
Well,
question.
no, wait a minute. I think
But before you answer, Dan,
I could give you several discoveries which would shake my faith right to the ground.
But let me just broaden the question.
Yeah.
Not only
Rabbits in the Precambrian.
No.
not only an argument for the plausibility of religious belief, but an argument that suggests that what we're up to, criticizing faith, is a bad thing.
Oh, that's much easier.
We shouldn't be doing. So
Yeah.
let's
That's-
exclude that.
Yes, by all means.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be doing what we're doing.
That's much easier.
Okay.
It's easier to think of a good
Oh,
reason.
I mean, somebody could come up with an argument that says that the world is a better place, and
Oh,
everybody
that, yeah.
believes a falsehood. And
Is there any context, though, in your work or in dialogue with your critics where you feel that argument has given you pause?
Oh yes. Not so much in Breaking the Spell, but when I was working on my book on free will, Freedom Evolves, I kept running into critics who who were basically expressing something very close to a religious view, namely, look, free will is such an important idea. If we gave up the idea of free will, we would have, people would lose a sense of responsibility and we would have chaos. And you really don't want to look too closely. Just avert your eyes. Do not look too closely at this issue of free will and determinism. And I thought about that explicitly in the environmental impact category. Okay, could I imagine that my irrepressible curiosity could lead me to articulate something, true or false,
It's dangerous.
which would have such devastating effects on the world that I should just shut up and change the subject? Right. And I think that's a good question that we all should ask.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time thinking hard about that, and I wouldn't have published either of those two books if I hadn't come to the conclusion that it was not only, as it were, environmentally safe to proceed this way, but obligatory. Mm. But I think you should ask that question. I do.
Right.
Before publishing a book, but not before deciding for yourself, do I think that this is true or not? One should never do what some politically motivated, often, critics do, which is to say, this is so politically obnoxious that it cannot be true.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a different
It's a different
point.
thing entirely.
Yeah.
No.
No, it would be like discovering that you thought that the bell curve
Yeah.
on white and black intelligence was a correct interpretation of IQ.
Yes, and you could well suppress publications.
Now I've looked at all this stuff again. I'm absolutely, you could say, now what am I going to do? Fortunately, these questions don't in fact present themselves in that way.
I'll tell you one place where it's presented itself to me. This I think it was an op-ed in the LA Times. I could be mistaken, but someone argued that the reason why the Muslim population in the U.S. is not radicalized the way it is in Western Europe is largely the result of the fact that we honor faith so much in our discourse that they have not become, the community has not become as insular and as grievance-ridden as it has
in Western Europe.
As in Western Europe. Now, I don't know if this is true, but if it were true, that gave me a moment's pause.
That would be of interest. James Wolfenson, of the later the World Bank, recently the negotiator on Gaza, says that he firmly believes that he had tremendous influence for good with the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas because he was an Orthodox Jew. If so, I think it would be disgusting, I have to say. And he shouldn't have had the job in the first place, because we know one absolute thing for certain about that conflict, which is that it's been made infinitely worse by the monarchy. If it were only a national and territorial dispute, it would have been solved by now. So, but his self-satisfaction in saying so, even if it were true, would turn me even more against him.